Okay, folks, I think we'll make a start. So everyone, someone sitting around outside. All right, thank you everyone for coming. This is a fantastic turnout. Didn't actually expect quite so many people, so that's really great, and glad to know you're all interested and motivated to know more about this. So that's the whole point of this evening is to try and explain more to Boxted what's happening, because it did feel a bit like there's either people that just don't know anything about it, haven't heard anything, haven't got the thing through their letterbox telling them it's happening, or they know something about it and they're worried about it, or just feel that they don't know anything about it. And then there will be people in this room that know a lot about it because they're right in the firing line, and they've probably already deep in discussions with National Grid and their representatives. But my aim today is to just try and go through a sort of a what, why, when, and what can we do to try and give us all a bit of information, and then hopefully we can try and answer some questions and discuss it, I guess. So again, welcome. I'm Jonathan Hunt. I'm one of the Boxted Parish councillors. There's a few other parish councillors in the room. Arabella, thank you for coming. And there's a few lurking at the back. Lee's in the corner. Amin's in the crowd. And if I missed anyone else, Angela's here as well. So yeah, there's plenty of parish councillors here. Tom Rowe, one of our Colchester city councillors, has come along this evening, so that's great. I think Lewis said he might be here. If it's not, he might sneak in. He's our Essex councillor. So there's several of us in the room. And first of all, thanks to everyone that sort of helped make this evening come together at quite short notice, because we suddenly realised that the Langham Consultation event is next week. So we wanted to encourage you to go to that. So we wanted to have a meeting kind of as soon as possible to kick things off, get people interested and motivated, and send them on their way with some idea of what to do. And also thanks to the team from Pylons East Anglia who are at the back. Please go and talk to them at the end about what they're doing and the great work they're doing in campaigning against this scheme. And if you go to any of the National Grid consultation events, you'll see them standing outside with their banners. So please do talk to them. So what is going on? What is National Grid proposing? Well, they're proposing a 180-kilometre long, 400 kilovolt AC transmission line from Norwich all the way down to Tilbury via us and the Dedham Vale. Conveniently so, because they want to connect to something called the EACN, the East Anglian Connector Node, which is a fancy name for just a massive, great big substation that they want to build at Ardleigh to connect to offshore wind farms off the coast of Frinton and out that way. And the purpose of this apparently is to harness the wind power that's being generated off the coast of East Anglia and take it down to the south where it's needed for distribution. As part of their Great Grid Upgrade, which is a piecemeal scheme of patching up pylons all over the country. And for us, we have the pleasure of a predominantly above ground pylon, 400 kilovolt pylon route all the way across East Anglia, as they're proposing, with the exception of a few key places where they're planning to go underground, still AC, so alternating current, in places such as the Dedham Vale, where it's thought to be too environmentally sensitive to have pylons, but we'll see how that's not quite true. Undergrounding is nowhere near environmentally sensitive either. So in terms of why, I couldn't genuinely explain why in my own words, because it would be incredibly cynical and skeptical. So I'll have to use National Grid's own words. And I do apologise in advance that quite a lot of the slides may be a little bit difficult to read because there's a lot of text on them. So don't worry too much about that. That's really because I want to be able to distribute this presentation, and I'm trying to record what I'm saying. We'll see if that works. If not, I'll have to record it again at home to put online so that we can send it to anyone who wasn't here this evening. So don't worry if you can't read everything that's on the screen, especially for the people at the back. I'll try and say it, or at least give you the gist of what's on the screen. The detail of the information is for people reading this afterwards. So in short there, why? I've touched on it already. The current transmission network around East Anglia is designed to kind of distribute power out from major centres, out from Norwich, out from Ipswich, and it's many years old now, up to 70 years old, and it's just not designed for the amount of power that is proposed to be brought into the region from offshore wind farms and also from offshore interconnectors. There's a few key these are big high power energy links to foreign countries such as Germany that will plan to bring power in and out of the country in the future, and they want to tack those into the grid. And in order to do that, they need to have a grid that's capable of taking the amount of power or transmitting the amount of power that those interconnectors need. So there's a whole bunch of things adding up that suggests that the energy network in this region isn't suitable at the moment for what is planned for the future, and so hence their Great Grid upgrade, and hence the proposal that they're putting forth. As many of you may know, there are viable alternatives as opposed to just tracking a massive pylon line across the countryside, and we will touch on that later. But that is what they are proposing, this pylon line. So what timelines are we dealing with? Well, we first knew about this back in 2022 when they launched the programme, and we've previously had 2 non-statutory public consultations. So you may have been involved in those, you may have heard about those, you may have responded to those. They're in the past now. Anything you said then has more or less been ignored, and it won't count towards the future. So if you have responded to them before, don't think that's your job done. That's gone, that's in the past. You need to respond to them now again, because this is now started on the 10th of April and it runs till the 18th of June, the statutory consultation. This is the one they have to do by law before they can move on with this process. So that's what's open now. That's why they are traveling the country, having these information events. Not this one, this is us. This is a better one. Their one is going to be in Langham, is the nearest one, and that's next week on the 16th, which I believe is Thursday. Conveniently my birthday, so what a treat. So please do go to that, engage, see what they have to say, take it with a pinch of salt, and then make your own decisions. So that will close on the 18th of June, and then they'll think about it for a year, and they're planning to submit what they call their DCO application in 2025. And the word DCO gets bounded around a lot in this, but it's a development consent order. It's a part of planning law that's almost above all other law. So most of our normal planning considerations don't come into it. It's an application they make to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State decides whether to approve their application or not, because it is a nationally significant infrastructure project. And if it's approved, they then basically have carte blanche to do what they want within the bounds of their DCO application. So they are planning to make that in 2025. We'd expect to see that slowed down by the amount of public opposition there is. So it may not happen for 2026, 2027, who knows? They may change their mind altogether. But at the moment, they're planning for 2025. And then they expect to have a decision on that within the year. They then expect to start construction within another year. So starting in 2027, with the big aim to be operational by 2031, which is trying to hit these magical numbers of 2030 for all these government targets for green energy, and to try and coincide with a bunch of new wind farms that are currently in development or in early development that are planning to come online by 2030. So that's their timeline. They're racing to try and get to 2030 to connect everything up, and they're trying to do it by the quickest and easiest route possible. So all very well. How is that going to affect us? Well, and I mean this with no disrespect to the people that are directly affected by this. As a parish, Boxted comes out of this fairly lightly. The area of our parish covered by the proposal is small, but still the amount of damage done is incredible. So there are other parishes that are almost completely covered by this programme of works. So in that sense, we're fortunate, but that doesn't detract from how destructive and how disruptive this programme would be for us. So what we're looking at here is the southern end of Straight Road, where Langham Road joins Straight Road and Pepper's Lane is opposite. And it's planning to run through the fields just to the north of there. So if you're coming from Colchester, turning right out of Langham Road onto Straight Road, immediately there, you may have seen some signs put up recently. That's where it's going to cross the road. And it's coming across from Langham from the airfield. So it will cross Langham Lane as well, on the east boundary of our parish. And it's going to exit our parish on the western boundary, just as you go into Great Hawksley. But at that point, it's going back underground again, and they're building a big ceiling compound, as they call it, in a field over there.
Why can't they put it underground?
Well, good question. And they have put it underground in other places. And we'll look at the impacts of that. And it may well be an argument that we have to ask for it to go underground through Boxted, given that it's underground either side of Boxted. Yeah. But then there will be other considerations to make about the impact that has. Yes, you won't see the pylons, but the disruption and destruction from the building of it will be greater. And I'll show you those differences so you can make your mind up over which you prefer. But at this point here, they're proposing pylons. So the purple dots, if you look at this map later, are the pylons, and there's a purple line, which is the stringing line between them. And then the red shape winding all over the place is that DCO outline, their development consent order, that's the area that they're kind of claiming and saying, if you give us permission to do this, everything within this red line is fair game for us. And it has some weird bits coming out of it because they need to protect pipelines that cross it. They need to underground smaller power lines that cross it. This weird loop that goes to the north of some houses is following a water pipeline. So they want to have the ability to dig it up if they need to, if something goes wrong or if there's a reason to. And you'll even see it extends for hundreds of meters either side of straight road along the verges, because they want the ability to be able to strip the hedges out, to be able to have visibility sight lines for their crossings for their vehicles. And we'll have a look at that in more detail in a minute. And then this weird shape in the field to the south, like directly opposite Coleman's Butchers. The reason there's that weird sort of bow tie shape is because this is one of the pylons where it changes direction, and they have to do some weird sort of tensioning magic, and that just involves using more space to pull the wires at different angles. So they have to take a larger space as their as part of their DCO. And what they're proposing is 50-meter pylons. So they're the largest you'll see in this country. So if you imagine the largest pylons you've seen when you travel the country, these are them on the right. You know, in Boxted at the moment, we're lucky if we see a 10-meter high, 13 kilovolt line. There's a few of them crisscrossing the village, but we've certainly never seen anything like 50 meters. And that's the sort of array of wires we'd be expected to see as well. So truly sort of a gargantuan prospect based on what we've previously had. What sort of other impacts are we going to see from an environmental point of view? There's a number of hedgerows across the pylon route, regardless of whether they do pylons or undergrounding. We can expect those to basically be grubbed out almost completely because they'll require space to work. They'll require space to pull the cables through before they then tension them up. That you can almost expect, or we have to fear the worst and expect that anything within that DCO red outline may well be destroyed as part of the construction phase. And they may not do that in the long run, but at this point in time, we have to assume that in order to build our argument against it for the harm that we think this project might cause us. So, like I say, from an environmental point of view, I'm particularly passionate about hedgerows, particularly some of our particularly old hedgerows in the parish. In particular, this one here over to the west, we went out there as part of the Boxted Wildlife Group and did a survey of it. It's a wonderful hedgerow full of quite mature oak trees. And that entire width of oak tree hedge you see there is directly within that red swathe, with the pylon passing pretty much smack down the middle of it. So I'd fully expect to see all that have to go if they got their way with this. From measuring the width of the trees, we figure they're somewhere in the region of 100 years old, and they're about 12 meters high at their highest there. So that's a 12-meter high oak tree, and we're talking about 50-meter high pylons. It just doesn't bear thinking about. And that field boundary that those oaks are on has been there since at least 1815, when the heath was enclosed. So I've no reason to believe it's not a 200-year-old hedge. Out of interest in this picture there, just sat, my little helper was just sat there in her high vis. Either side of there is two quite big gaping gaps in the hedge. That's where an Anglian water pipeline came through 10 years ago. 10 years later, the hedge still not recovered. So what can we expect from these pylons? Probably much the same. Over to the east in the fields, again, opposite Langham Road, opposite the Butchers. I'm looking at the wrong screen on here. Sorry, there you go. Again, long native hedgerows full of all the different species we'd expect to find in our hedgerows around here. And the worst part here is most of the hedgerows are running a low angle to the pylon route. So you can expect the whole hedgerow to go because it's running parallel to where they need to run the cables. So you can just imagine now the views we see when we look out from Langham Road across towards Boxted. That was the inspiration for the picture that was used as the backdrop for this event. You can very much imagine that. Of course, environmental impacts are one thing. The human impacts are what I imagine most people are here for this evening. Either your house is right next to or within a certain distance of, or even if you don't live anywhere near that end of the village. Every time you drive into Boxted, you will see these mammoths on the landscape, or if they do go underground, you will see the scars of the undergrounding every time you enter and exit Boxted. If you're coming up Langham Road and Straight Road, you're driving straight underneath it. If you're going out Dedham Road through Langham, they're coming right across Dedham Road as you get to the Langham Hall estate. And then as you go out, if you went out the other side of the village, or either on Church Street or out on Queenshead Road towards Hawksley, on your left, everything that's going on at Hawksley would be in view because it's such a flat, high plane out there. Everything is just so visible. So even where they underground it to go around Hawksley, the apparatus, the big substation that's used to send the power underground is just going to be a massive hulk on the landscape. And obviously people are concerned about house prices living adjacent to this, concerned about just impacts on mental and physical health in fighting this battle against it. I wanted to have a look at in the parish. It's not very clear on the projectors, so I implore you to go back and look at this. But how many houses are within certain distance of this pylon route or of the undergrounding route, and within 500 meters in let me go back to my screen because it's a lot clearer. Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry, the blue one's Boxted. In Boxted, within 500 meters of the whole route, we have about 200 houses, but actually Langham and Hawksley have far more houses in close proximity to the route. So, and that's you can see. I can't see now. So, like I say, we're in terms of the impact on our population, we're perhaps on the lower scale, even just taking these three parishes as a whole, particularly Langham, because the pylon line is running to the south of them across the airfield over to Ardley, where it goes to this massive substation, and then it's coming back out of Ardley underground and running back through Langham to the north to cross the Dedham Vale. So Langham will just be encircled by this destruction and during the construction phase, and then the ensuing years of however long it takes to recover after that. Lost my presenter view. There we go. So one thing that interests me, particularly as well, as someone interested in the countryside and topography, etc., that's a topographic map of Boxted with the Dedham Vale running in the green there. The actual kind of height difference between the bottom of the Dedham Vale, where the Cllr River is, and sort of up here on the plain, up in Boxted or Hawksley, is about 50 meters. So these pylons are as tall as the Stour Valley is deep at this point, and yet they're planning to put them across the top of that on the high ground. So to the south there, the high ground where it's getting lighter towards Hawksley and the White, these 50-meter mammoths are going to be on top of what is essentially a 50-meter hill. So looking south from the north of the Dedham Vale, this is vertically exaggerated, so it looks odd, but it's the only way to be able to see it on a screen, because otherwise in reality it's quite flat and everything's far away. But exaggerating it, you can see that the top of the pylons there in the red dots are as tall again as the valley is deep. And I guess I hadn't really appreciated that even until today, just how big 50 meters is in that respect. When you go and stand over on the Church Street side of Boxted and look out across the Dedham Vale, and you've got that wonderful valley. If you put the pylons at the bottom of it, they would reach the top. It's incredible. Just doesn't bear thinking about. So I mentioned earlier about these long red stretches along Straight Road where they're going to reserve the right to do what they want to the verges and the hedges in order to achieve their visibility splays, which is just a posh word for like being able to see out of the junction. Because another factor that perhaps some people don't consider is that during the construction phase, they're building a haul road, almost the entire route of the pylon route, and certainly the entire route of the underground as well. And that's the black hatched thinner shape that swiggles its way across the line. And everywhere this haul road hits the main road, it's got to cross it. And so everywhere that they're going to have to build a junction, and they've got very specific designs for how they need to build their junctions in order for these large trucks to be able to turn in and out, large cranes to be able to turn in and out, and for the truck drivers and crane drivers to be able to see up and down the road to be able to safely enter and exit the junction, or in our case on Straight Road, it will just end up being a crossroads, and it'll probably end up with traffic lights on it, probably, you would expect. So that's why they sort of reserve the right by trying to define this DCO to include hedgerows and verges. So if they need to those will just be taken out in order to give them their visibility splays. So truly catastrophic for the areas where that could be happening as well. And those haul roads, typical cross section at the bottom. The haul road is about 8 meters wide, and they'll build that for the entire length of the pylon route. And then all the soil that comes out of building the haul road has to go in bunds next to it. So you're looking at 50 or 60 meters of disturbance in total, with drainage ditches and piling up of the soil, and again another diagrammatic example of what they think a haul road meeting a road would look like. So from the road during the construction phase, these are going to look like industrial premises. You're going to have gates, fences, lay down compounds, probably some site offices, and then the haul road stretches off into the field with the bunds of soil next to it and the drainage ditches. So truly will be a sort of industrial process. And although it might be hopeful to think, oh, well, that's just the construction phase and it will last for however many years it lasts, 5 or 6 years, it's not true. They have to renew parts of this whole network every 30, 40 years. So they'll be back. And in some places, they'll leave their haul roads and access roads permanently to be able to have permanent access to certain pylons for maintenance purposes. So they say typically a pylon lasts about 80 years. So 80 years time, they have to come and redo it all again or come up with a better plan. And certainly every 40 years, they have to come back and restring it and replace a bunch of the insulators and different things. And unfortunately, the underground option actually has an even lower life expectancy. So the underground cables only have a life expectancy of 40 to 50 years. So massive amount of disruption to lay these cables underground. What do you do in 40, 50 years time? Dig it all back up again or just leave it there? Who knows? But certainly just building it is not the end of the story. So an example of where undergrounding is happening is the Dedham Vale. And what particularly offends me is this area over near Stratford St Mary, where to cross the river, they propose to split into two to supposedly lessen the damage, I don't know, or just because there is enough space width through. But as a result, they're splitting in two to go around this wonderful lake, the Black Tarn, which I know from personal experience, kayaking up and down the river is absolutely full of wildlife and reeds and rushes and all sorts of things. And they're proposing to just go around it in these two massive swathes. They are fortunately proposing to drill under the river, so they don't have to just dig a trench through the river, which would be sort of an engineering nightmare. But still, the scope for environmental damage is still particularly high. And notwithstanding the many flood events we've had in recent years, what happens if there's a 1 in 1,000-year flood whilst they're working on this part of the project? It just doesn't bear thinking about. And ultimately, even though they're splitting into two smaller swathes, the cumulative impact of that is still greater than the one single swathe of undergrounding. So for some reason, they're actually targeting more destruction than normal in the Dedham Vale, which is counterintuitive. The whole idea is to try and reduce the amount of destruction in the Dedham Vale. And then, as I've said, this carries on down, so it's underground down through Langham, which isn't our parish, but many of you will regularly drive out through Langham on the Dedham Road to get on the A12 or to get straight for St Mary or to get to Dedham. And it's coming across the road there, across all the fields there. So there'll be no escape from it during the construction phase. And the continued damage to the environment after the work is done will be visible to all as well, because the undergrounding, this is what they're proposing, is that to underground it, they have to have 3 trenches, each containing 3 cables, and they have to be spaced out a certain distance apart because of different electrical properties and capacitance of the soil. So in order to underground this power line, they require a 120-meter wide stretch of ground to be disturbed. They strip that entire 120 meters because they have to pile the soil at the edges of it. Then they dig their trenches in the middle, and then they do fill it back in, but then nothing deep rooted is ever allowed to grow above or within 3 meters of each of those trenches. which actually ends up resulting in a permanent 50-metre wide swathe that isn't allowed to regrow to what it was before. So that was a point I was going to make later. Yeah, that's the whole road down the middle, and then there's 3 trenches either side. Yeah.
18k.
Yes, I suppose it is.
And be 18k long.
I don't know if that's how it translates. It might. I think it's slightly different from the ground. I'm not sure. But this is just taken straight from the website and the consultation documents. So you can find that.
I think it's important to point out that for the underground, there's also going to be access only to permanent stuff.
Yeah.
Access to the cables. I can't remember what the exact.
They have to build jointing compounds where the cables are joined together, and they need to be able to access that.
Exact space.
Um, So the undergrounding is not the silver bullet that it might sound like to some people, although it does mean we don't have to see the pylons. The effects of it are that there's a never going away scar on the environment there. And you may have seen in recent times the Anglian water pipeline work that's going on nearby and coming through our village, coming through Arabella's land. This is on a much smaller scale, but it's kind of a potent of what might be to come, but only on a bigger scale is what will happen if for the undergrounding through Langham and Dedham Vale, probably 3 or 4 times bigger than what Anglian Water are doing. So truly massive scars on our landscape. And as I mentioned, it's a regular refute from some people to say, oh, but it will grow back. Like I say, not so much. Not only do they need to sustain access to some of these places, some of the pylons need regular access, and as Tom says, some of the underground equipment needs regular access. But as National Grid say themselves in a document that you can link at the bottom there will be restrictions on the planting of trees and hedges over the cables or within 3 meters of the cables. So that means that entire 50-meter swathe can't be replanted. So there's going to be a 50-meter corridor all the way through the Dedham Vale that isn't being replanted. Similarly, for overhead lines, tree growth is discouraged and controlled beneath the power between the overhead line or within distances where trees could fall onto the lines. Well, none of the trees are taller than 50 meters, so I don't think they're really going to fall onto the pylon, but I get their gist. That just gives them carte blanche to remove as much as they want in the interests of safety, and also they will need access under the power line whilst they're building it. So I would expect wherever a power line crosses a hedge or crosses some trees, they would be gone. And it does also go on to say where cables are installed by direct burial, so the undergrounding route, there are restrictions on the use of deep cultivating equipment to avoid the risk of disturbance. So I don't know how many landowners or farmers we have in the room, but the soil around here is particularly clayey and does require some pretty good deep mole ploughing from time to time. And so having an underground cable running across your land is probably going to be a bit of an inconvenience. So again, another big negative. And as I mentioned, this phrase had kind of snuck past me when I've been looking at this diagram before. But the key word in the middle being permanent swathe, the 50-meter permanent swathe. You know, the undergrounding route does sound like a great option until you realise that 50 meters is just forever going to be, well, no, it's not going to be nothing. It'll be grass or it'll be crops, but it's certainly never going to be hedgerows or trees again. So that's what we stand to lose along that route. So, and then I guess to come back to the point that was made earlier, could we campaign to have the route through Boxted undergrounded? Yes, and that would then maybe allay a lot of the concerns about seeing pylons and hearing them and being near them. But we'd have to weigh that up against the fact of the amount of damage that would be done by that process, and also whether there is actually physically enough space for it. I mean, that's not our problem to consider. That's National Grid's problem. If we say that's what we want, that's their problem to work out. But that's why I just want to make it clear that I don't think it's a clear case of push it all underground. But there are other alternatives, which I will mention shortly. So I guess the real thing is, what can we do? And some people would say nothing. And there's a quote that gets bandied around a lot. I heard it in a song and then I found out it was actually stolen from somewhere else. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And it does feel a bit like that these days with some of the things that people get away with. So we certainly should stand for something. In this case, I've heard people talk about the inevitability of it. Oh, it's just going to happen anyway. Oh, it's National Grid. They'll do what they want. Well, I love this quote from a band that I'm particularly fond of. Unless you fight the inevitable, you'll never know if it truly was. Essentially, if you accept the inevitable, it's a self-enforcing prophecy. It is inevitable. Unless you fight it, you'll never know if it truly was inevitable. So I don't think there is any inevitability in this, and I'm quietly confident about it. But what can we do to fight that inevitability? Well, the main thing that we are tasked with now as the public is to engage in this consultation, not to ignore it, not to bury our heads in the sand and hope it'll go away, but to actually engage with National Grid and tell them how much we don't like it. Or maybe you do like it. I don't want to put any ideas in your head. But like I said, the first thing you can do in the near term is next week, if you're available during the inconvenient hours when it will be on, is go to Langham Village Hall on the 16th of May and meet with some of their representatives. I do feel sorry for them, the people that are employed to go to these events, because they've got nothing to do with it. They've got no say in it, and they've just got the absolute vitriol of the entire East Anglia descending on them. So do go easy on them, but also do challenge them on some of the things that they can't substantiate. Challenge them if they can't actually draw upon a piece of evidence that they claim to know. You know, we're all about trying to find holes in this consultation. Two things they will encourage you to do is to complete their online feedback form or to complete their hard copy. We do have a hard copy of it here if anyone wants to see it. We probably wouldn't suggest you do that because they are quite leading questions and you will end up agreeing to it one way or another. The best thing you can do, honestly, is to write your real opinions down, or either in an email or in a letter to them and send that, because they have to count it. I see a lot of you are signing the quick and easy kind of I don't want this form at the back, and that's great. And the more people that sign that and send it off, the better. But unfortunately, National Grid have proven that they scan all the responses, and if a lot of them are very similar, they kind of put them all in a bin, not an actual bin, well, it probably is an actual bin. They put it in a bin and say, this is a campaign response. So it's great because it does show the number of people that are passionate about it, but at the same time, do also go away and put down your own thoughts and send something that's unique to you, because then at least that will count as a unique response. So the simple response that some of you may have signed at the back of the room there, like I say, it's great, it does a job, but you just know National Grid are going to say this is a campaign, and there was 600 responses that all said the same thing. And then, although they should pay attention to that and count that as 600, we can't guarantee they will. So please do also send your own responses. So what would a response be structured like if you were going to go away and sort of write your own, if you didn't really know where to start? The key things you could cover in order of importance, I believe, are, well, I've been advised, actually, this is probably the best order, as well as being my own belief. I'm not just making it up. It's number one, really focus on the demonstrable harm caused by the current proposal. And this is a key facet of all planning. This is what the planning officers at Colchester do when they receive your application for a modest extension and they reject it for unknown reasons. It's all about demonstrable harm. Is what's being proposed causing some harm to someone or something, and can you demonstrate it? So that's a key thing, and we can all, I think, come up with our own lists. For some people that'll be specific and personal, i.e. this is taking away part of my garden, or you've drawn your red line through some of my buildings, you know, specific harms. For other people, it might be things they're passionate about, like, for instance, the hedgerows or the landscape character. Just demonstrating the harm that this specific proposal causes is the most important thing that we can do at this stage of the consultation, because that's what we're being asked to do, essentially. You could then go on to point two, to talk about changes or mitigations. So say, you know, I've demonstrated all these harms, you're doing all this damage, but if you move this pylon 100 meters away, it wouldn't do the same amount of damage. So you might want to list some mitigations that you could see as being possible, maybe. Then you could perhaps, if you have knowledge of or are interested in the other options, the other viable options for not having a pylon line in the first place, using different methods or going offshore. If that interests you, you could write that down, and that's certainly what we are all pushing for in general. But in this consultation, I worry that National Grid kind of just keeps shrugging that off. I'll come back to that, but that's why I put that lower down the list. And then fourth, it's important to also note any criticism you have of the consultation process. Did you not receive any documentation you feel you should have? There's quite a split in the village between people that did receive the information packs through their door and those that didn't. Are you in the direct firing line and you've heard nothing from them? I spoke to someone today whose house is totally encapsulated by the project, but not actually affected by it. It's just it goes round them completely. And National Grid keeps sending them maps with the wrong property on it. Any sort of just omissions and errors in this consultation process, they're all valuable to document. And certainly the campaign group are trying to document all of those to make a case that this entire consultation is just not legally binding and needs to be done again. So if you feel that applies to you, please make sure to sort of write it down in your response.
You've got Darren's
So the Pylons East Anglia, yes, they've employed a barrister to give them legal advice on everything. And I'm going to give them a plug at the end, but it's definitely worth going to their website and seeing what they've done. I'm not directly involved with the campaign group, but I've heard a lot of what they're doing, and I've helped them with a few things, and they've helped me with this. It was great. So I definitely recommend seeing what the information they're putting out, because it is very useful information, and it is backed up by that knowledge that is coming from someone who knows what they're talking about. So yeah, that's stage one. The demonstrable harm could be things like damage to a heritage asset, either direct physical damage, potential damage from haul trucks, etc. If you're in a listed building and you're on one of the routes that they're planning to use for their haul trucks, the impact on setting, that's one of the most important things about listed buildings, is the setting. You can't change the colour of your drive because it might damage the setting of your listed building, yet someone can build a massive 50-metre tall metal pylon in front of it. Question those sort of things. Archaeology, they will have claimed to have done some archaeological inspection already, but they can't feasibly do the whole route. So if there's things about the archaeology of the area, feed that back to them. Environments and habitats, I've already talked about the hedges. That's just one example. Landscape character and views, that's what I think a lot of people are most worried about in Boxted. We are rural, we are on the cusp of and extending into the Dedham Vale National Landscape. Why are we having this foisted upon us? Proximity to residents and businesses, I touched upon earlier about, and I can pull up more data about how many houses are X distance away from it, but it's worrying. Public rights of way will be damaged in the short term during construction and potentially irreparably damaged forever. Talk about demonstrable harm, breaches of the Halford rules. If you have enough time to go away and read about them, they dictate how pylons should be placed on the landscape. And if you think the National Grid haven't followed those rules, and you can identify particular pylons that you think are in the wrong place, tell them about it. Impacts on tourism. I know we're not a particularly touristic area, but a lot of people do come out of town to Boxted and to the Dedham Vale to enjoy the lovely nature of it, and they'll have to drive under a pylon line every time they do it. And then, of course, human, physical and mental health, and I guess in brackets, financial health, and financial health impacts mental health. So all of those things for people who are living in close to the pylons and are worried about what effect it will have on their business or the worth of their house or their land, and whether they'll get adequate compensation if they are losing land for a pylon, etc. Changes on mitigations to reduce harm could be things like saying you need to move pylon X to avoid ancient tree at location Y, or just adjust the alignment to move it away from this property, or as we talked about earlier, you could underground this part of the route through Boxted. It would save you having to go up and down all the time. Just have a big underground section. Could be something that you say. Or, for instance, you need to move a haul road because the haul road is going through a nesting habitat for a species I've identified, etc. Changes that they could make. The other options section, and you'll find a lot of information about this from the East Anglian Pylons group, and I don't claim at all to be an expert on it, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but there is a lot of information out there, and this isn't just information that's been made up by members of the public who are angry about the scheme. This is good information that's been researched by government bodies who are tasked with the task of working out how this should be done. So many case studies and models have been run to work out these various routes. And National Grid claims to have taken the one that they think is best, but we don't believe they've actually provided enough evidence for why they think it's best. So do go away and explore those options and see what you think. Ultimately, it's not our responsibility to actually suggest a viable alternative, but it's very useful for us to know there are viable alternatives. We couldn't just campaign against the widening of the A12 by saying everyone should fly. It's just not viable. So in the same way, it's just useful to know that there's viable alternatives and they should be looked into. So the offshore ring main idea is something you'll hear a lot about. But there's also alternative methods of underground cables that don't take up so much space. So instead of high voltage AC undergrounding, high voltage DC is a technology that exists and one that's only going to get more feasible in the coming years up to when this comes live. And it's far less still destructive, but far less destructive. Or high voltage DC cables out at sea. And even options such as brownfield site usage. We've got a wonderful box on the end of the Dengie Peninsula that used to be full of nuclear waste. And it's just sat there connected to the grid doing nothing. That would be a wonderful place to bring in some power lines from the North Sea and run them out through the pylons that already exist there that currently aren't doing anything. I'm talking about Bradwell Power Station. So challenge the lack of alternatives that National Grid have offered. They've already made their mind up before these consultations even began, and they haven't really gone back to prove that. They just stuck their head in the sand and said, this is what we're doing. So challenge that and challenge the lack of evidence that they haven't shown for that. The problem with all of this is the fact that there's a lack of holistic thinking about the whole nation. National Grid isn't this wonderful, oh, good for the nation, let's have a national grid. It's a private company owned by a lot of foreign interests. It is a profit-making company. It's not the NHS. So they're trying to do things by the most profitable means possible. When what is needed is actually a kind of holistic countrywide view of how do we reconfigure the entire country for our future needs. And also a big part, I think, is why do we keep projecting all this future need? We should be thinking about needing a bit less energy, but there we go. So the problem with a lot of what National Grid uses as their argument against offshore is they're proposing a sort of piecemeal approach where they come onshore and then go offshore again and then go around a bit and then come onshore, go off. And when they add that all up, they come up with a big number and say that's too big. We don't want to pay for that. Whereas what many groups and government bodies are looking at is a more holistic approach to how can you join things up in a more sensible way so they don't have to keep coming on and offshore. Things could be connected better offshore, or some of these interconnectors that these big cables going to foreign countries, why couldn't they just go to more sensible places? Like, why does it have to come from Germany to Frinton to join this East Anglian connector node when it could just go straight to Tilbury? But it's already undersea anyway, so why is it coming on land? So there's, again, like I say, our place is not to come up with these ideas. We are not the group that we're not the think tank as much as I wish we were. Yeah, and this is a big problem for everyone east of Ardleigh. Ardleigh's going to get, based on the current plans, Ardleigh's getting these massive substations to deal with all these connections from all these wind farms, as well as this interconnector. And then everyone east of Ardleigh has got to deal with the connection from Ardleigh out to sea. And it's the same for people in Suffolk, where they're bringing cables ashore there from Sealink. So yeah, there's lots of places on the coastline that are at risk from having these cables coming out. When what many people are saying is, isn't there a better way of doing this? So, like I said, the fourth point, and I already sort of mentioned this, was make sure you tell National Grid that you're not happy with their consultation. Criticise where it's gone wrong. Obviously, tell them if it's gone well. But if you feel the drop-in events were too all over the place in weird places, last year they organised one on the same day as the tendering show. The Chelmsford one is not actually in Chelmsford, it was at the racecourse, which is basically in Dunmow, and there's no public transport links. All these sort of criticisms about how they could have done a better job of actually getting more people involved. Particularly, be very interested to know if there's anyone who has different needs, who doesn't feel that their needs have been catered for. Have you just received a load of paperwork and you can't read it, or for whatever reason, or you haven't been able to physically access one of their events because of where they've planned it, or because of actual physical limitations at that site. Those sort of observations would be particularly damning of this, because they should be doing a better job of getting everyone involved in this consultation. And just general difficulty of understanding proposals. Not everyone can read a map, particularly the ones they sent through, which are particularly fine scale, and you can't particularly see what's going on. So make sure you criticise those things as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
One of the criticisms that we're aware of is that they've not taken into account the reduction in value of people's properties.
Yeah.
But that's not mentioned anywhere in there. Where does that kind of comment go?
I would say that's a material harm.
Yeah.
That is a material harm to the people on the route. And as far as we know at the moment, their budget for compensation doesn't really cover what it's likely to be.
They're not on your land, you get nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So being directly adjacent to it, yeah. So
I think I think that's been mentioned before, but the consultation, obviously, the non-statutory consultation processes, nothing's happened about those comments which have been made over and over again, isn't it? So
Yeah.
that's maybe a consultation issue as well.
yeah, in that final point saying
Yeah.
that I've made these points before and I don't feel like anyone's listened to them, or I've repeatedly told you that this is a protected woodland and you're still going to go through it, or I've repeatedly told you that I live next door to it and it's going to affect me. You've done nothing about it. That's a fair criticism of their consultation, as much as it is a criticism of the proposal itself.
There's no law, they don't got to pay you to do valuation either.
No, but the campaign group are looking into, I've forgotten the word. They are looking into potential legal case for is blight the right word? I feel like it could be blight, but yeah. But I agree, that is difficult if that is the law. I keep using the word material harm because plan is like that word, but all of those things are material harms. If they are physically causing some harm to your livelihood or your health or your financial health, those are the things to document. There was a particularly good meeting last week between the Pylon campaign group and Bernard Jenkin, and because it was in Boxted, I got to sit in on it and listen. And one of the points they raised was, well, how much can we trust their estimate of? They're constantly coming back to this estimate of how much this is going to cost and saying, no, everything else is too expensive. This is it. But how have they got to that number? What contingencies they built in, and what compensations are in there? Over time, how much is this project going to build up where it actually turns out it's actually more expensive than going offshore because of all these other things they have to pay for? So that's again such an important reason for why as many people as possible need to make themselves heard on this, and they need to start to realise that people aren't just rolling over and letting this happen. They are going to have to start coughing up for this, and it's going to adjust the balance of their finances.
So one of the things, and I picked it up on the first time I made, was the impact that their option analysis was based on the least regret method. Well, every other public project should use the green book exercise, which is based on treasury. You get very different answers. Because least regret gives you the cheapest option. Well, the green book exercise takes everything into account, including the social impact and wider impact on communities. So I assume that something that we should raise as a criticism on the consultation, or is it more regarding the campaign group? And
well, if you're aware of that, then that's worth, and that is something that the campaign group are on recommends, that challenging them on where they may have not followed the Treasury Green Book or not. I could go into every single thing, but that's if it's something you're aware of and you know about, then yes, of course, challenge it.
That was one of the most flakiest answers I got out of the gentleman who was leading the project.
They do pick and choose their justifications for it. Tom, did you have a point on that? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, anything that you have about specific individual cases of harm, things that individual points of, sort of like you have to your area or something that you're concerned about, you could raise them. Go to the City Council and put together, along with the other councils, the Essex Council, MPs, every other, in order to put together a It's not meant to that. A response, you know, sort of against this effectively, and the unfortunately the resource that Boxted City Council has is only one person.
Right.
So anything that you have, if you can send to me or to Dennis as at the back there, who's also your city councillor, or to your parish councillors if you feel, you know, more comfortable doing that. And that would be really good if we can pass that on to the chap that's doing this, and then he can include that. And it makes the, if we've got local information, if we've got individual cases, it makes the weight of that document just that bit more, you know, a bit more weighty, a bit more important, and you know, it sort of feeds into the whole thing, you know. So yeah, if you can put that as well, it would be really, really helpful.
You've nicely introduced my next slide. There you go. It's just right to these one from people. There's two of them in the room. Darius snuck in. It's not. Don't think you're having a moan at them. But as far as I know, every single one of our local councillors is on the side of there's a better way to do this, and pylons is not the answer. So you're not moaning at them. You're just giving them ammunition to take forward. And as Tom says, there's James Ryan from Colchester City Council, who's actually really good. He's already been out to Boxted 2 weeks ago. A few of us went for a walk with him, walked the entire route where the pylon was going to be. He had all the maps with him. He made lots of notes, wrote lots of things on them. So he's really proactive about this. He's been going around to all the affected parishes. And like I say, he will be collating Colchester City's response. So the more information we can feed in, the more thorough you can make that. And the more information people can feed in to me, the more thorough we can make the parish response. But realistically, the parish response is only as powerful as any single individual person's response. So it's better if however many of you submit your own response as opposed to just one parish response, because 50 is better than one. And of course, we also have a very active MP, Bernard Jenkin, who again is very much on this side of the argument. So much so that, and this is verbatim from his website, he's the chair of a group of MPs called the Offshore Electricity Grid Task Force. They've called themselves Offset, and they're a group of MPs that are all affected by this. Is coming through all their constituencies, and they want to see a better alternative. So you don't even need to write to him convincing him. He's already convinced, but you should write to him supporting him, and he will happily add that to his list of support that he's got. It just gives him more reason to carry on and more authority. You know, he is our representative in government, and so the more we support him, the more power he carries. And he's doing very good things from what I understand from the meeting that I was party to last week. It's difficult. Yeah.
Are these actually green? Like,
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? You're told that if you argue against this pylons, you're somehow anti-green. I don't think that's the case. I don't think anyone's saying that wind power isn't a good thing. And certainly it's not the amazing thing it's claimed to be. And electric cars aren't the amazing things they're claimed to be. And they're part of the thing that's driving this need for power. But there should be better ways. If we're going to stake all of our future on offshore wind, we should do it in a better way, not just piecemeal ripping up the countryside to connect the next big thing, but coming up with a sensible plan. You know, if you were to rewire this room, you'd put a ring main all the way around and enough sockets to make it work. You wouldn't just do a different line every day just because you felt like it, or string 100 different extension leads across the room. You know, so why can't we have that holistic approach? And part of the problem with our country is it's a legacy of once upon a time, all the power generation was in the Midlands along the coal seams where there was ample coal. And then we started building gas-fired power stations that needed to be near the coast where the gas was being brought into the country. And then we built nuclear power stations near the coast as well, but in different places. And so we've got this weird grid where there's lots of radial networks coming out from those old power stations that are now defunct in the Midlands, sitting there doing nothing. And then a few random ones on the coast, but we don't have capacity for all this power suddenly coming into the country from outside, whereas previously it came from inside out. So I see the justification for why things have to change, but they should change in a better way. If we want to actually be green about it, let's do something sensible.
I can't understand is if they're generating this electricity 20 miles out to sea.
Yeah.
The electric, they're going to come along the cables under the sea and then pop up and go on there. Why don't they bring the cables down through, still under the sea, same cable, but go all the way down to Tilbury?
I mean, you're preaching to the converted. That is very much the point, I think. There are technical challenges.
The whole point around having joined that fencing, there's just no less view around on that. That's why the offshore grid makes more sense.
And one, if you look at the bigger map, we've got some on the back to show the whole route. This route starts at a substation that's like 10 miles south of Norwich. It's not even on the coast. It's nowhere near the coast. So it's slightly disingenuous to think of it as being this wonderful connection between wind farms and the south. And there's some good arguments as well. I mean, this is all conjecture, but there's arguments that even when the power gets to Tilbury, there's not enough network infrastructure at Tilbury to get it to where it needs to be. So is the whole route even viable in the first place? There's many questions, and again, it's not really our place to come up with those answers, but that's the sort of thing the campaign group is pressing on and is leaning on the likes of Bernard and others to take forward to government to say, look, come on, there's got to be a better way of doing this. You know, when you're considering a very complex operation, there's obviously like 100 different permutations of the problem that you could try and model, and specific scenarios have been chosen and modelled, and they come up with a price and then they say that's too expensive. But that doesn't mean that was the best one. It just means that the one they chose to test wasn't. So there is an argument that there are other alternatives to using Bradwell that could be viable, and it's just not being considered. So again, it's another reason for just keeping the public pressure on to give our representatives the ammunition to keep pushing for it. So that's why writing to Sir Bernard and writing to your councillors is so important. Yeah, that EACN is a massive red herring, because why is it there? And I don't want to keep going on, but I've written a letter about why is this even coming through the Devon Vale, and the fundamental reason is because they wanted to, because they've already decided to put the EACN there at Ardley. When was that decided? Who gave that? There's been a lot of incremental decisions that have slipped under the radar of getting permission to do these other things, and then suddenly it's this big scheme to connect it all up that's raised everyone's awareness. But for however many years they've been planning to build that substation at Ardley, and they've just been getting away with it. No one's really realised. But you're right, if that wasn't there, if the Tarkon interconnector didn't come into Ardley, if those two wind farms, which I got, one of them you mentioned, the other one I forgot the name of, if they didn't have to come in there, you wouldn't need a substation at Ardley. You wouldn't need the power stations to come through the Devon Vale. You wouldn't need the power lines to come through Devon Vale. You wouldn't need the power lines to come through Boxted. Problem solved for us. But if they still go ahead and run it around the outside, it's still a problem for the rest of East Anglia. Yeah, they've not published a breakdown of how they get to that figure. And that comes back to some of the points that have been raised about compensation as well. How much of that cost have they attributed to compensation? How much are they attributed to contingencies? It's obviously not going to be straightforward. When was the last time a large scale infrastructure thing actually happened on budget and on time scale? Never. So how much room is there? Are they just quoting the lowest estimate? What's the upper estimate, or what's the range of that, and how did they get there? And then
can I say, I'm not terribly good at maths, but I think HS2 came in at over 66 billion before it was axed. I mean, the people in this room know what. Partly axed.
It was a half-axed operation.
Because I read about the costs of the offshore grid as opposed to coming from Norwich to Tilbury. I'm sure the campaign group can put me right. The overland route is by far the cheapest, it's about 3 billion. And the offshore would be 6 billion, which is still 1/10 of the axed HS2.
Yeah.
Please correct me if I'm wrong.
It's in those ballparks, and
So,
at a country scale,
Yeah.
yes, that's it's pocket change.
so they don't, yeah, exactly.
Why are we splitting hairs over it, destroying countryside for the sake of 1 or 2 warheads?
Who's big enough to challenge them and get them to give the breakdown?
Well, that's the campaign group have requested that Bernard does that, and so he's big enough to lean on them, I think. Well, it could be, and if enough people put in a request, that would make them listen. You'd like to think so, wouldn't you? But then they could drag their feet on that. They can make that last months, can they?
So the so your proposal is to or your alternative proposal would be to have an offshore energy grid.
That's one of them.
The offshore grid, even though the land below or the seabed is only roughly about 20 to 30 metres below sea level, it is still relatively vulnerable because it can't be seen from things like trawling or movements in the sea or
Sediments,
or even hostile states.
Yeah, and that is one of the arguments. Yeah.
How would you present the mitigation to the national grid, for example?
Well, I mean, I come back to the point that it's not our job to actually propose these alternatives, just to know that there are alternatives and they're not completely infeasible. Yeah, there are those challenges, I agree, and those are documented challenges.
I think it's also important to note that there are already those existing cables regarding the sea. So all of those problems that you pointed out already exist, and we already have to make them. So
They put a new one, haven't they, at Peterhead? In Scotland, they've actually done undergrounding to the wind farms on the so they can do it.
There's a project in inception at the moment to bring power in from North Africa.
Yeah.
That's the Devon Cornwall coast.
Oh yeah.
Solar farms in North Africa. So if that's not a risk, I don't know what else is.
Yeah, there's always gonna be risks on any project. So the only answer I can give you is that we do need to act in this consultation and be heard. So do attend the consultation event in Langham if you can, ask them these questions, see if they can answer them for you. They probably won't. Then please do support the campaign. Talk to these lovely people at the back of the room. Look at the information they have. It's a very active campaign group. Like I said, it's fundraising to pay for the legal fees. It's not making a profit for itself. It's putting all of its money into campaigning. It's a very active community online and on social media, and they're responsible for all the signs you see as you travel around East Anglia. So they're doing fantastic work, and you can find out much more information on their website, which I'll have a link for somewhere. Do write to your MPs and councillors. Don't feel like you're nagging them. They want to have your support to go forth. And finally, I think we should stay positive. I mean, I'm fairly positive about this. I think if you've got multiple MPs on your side all saying this is a stupid idea and there's better alternatives, that can only be a good thing. Oh yeah, sorry, Angela. One.
Should we also, obviously, like to Bernard Jenkins, but with the view that we might change that, should we also at this stage be writing to the opposition?
Oh, write to whoever you want. I mean, yeah, write to everyone. There's a website. I think it's actually just called Write to Them. Is that if anyone can correct it? It's called Write to Them. Or Google it, and it basically lists the contact details of all elected representatives, because ultimately they should be contactable. They are elected representatives, so you can email anyone you want. I'm just saying, as a bare minimum, our local councillors and our local MP would be the ones to support. Certainly, if you're happy to take down my email address, then copy me on any emails you send so I can collate them as part of our parish response. But that's effectively the end of what I had to say, and that's a lot longer than the half an hour I thought it was going to be.
16th May, what time is it and when?
Really inconvenient. It's at the Village Hall in Langham. Is it 2? Oh, I thought it started at 11. That's weird. Okay, 2 till 7. There you go. And Tom, did you have something to say?
yeah, no, I just say look, these events don't put themselves on. It takes a lot of hard work. It's all done in the individual time. Like I said, thank you very much, Jonathan.